going to present about queer ecology tonight. But beforehand, I'm trying to I will introduce Jessica, which she is the government and community relations coordinator at the TRCA. She's gonna introduce the land acknowledgement for the TRCA, and we're gonna move forward on our webinar tonight. All right.
Thank you, Mustafa. Welcome everybody to our town hall on queer ecology. I'd like to start by delivering a land acknowledgement. So, although we find ourselves geographically dispersed today, meeting together in this online environment, I'd like to begin by recognizing that wherever we are, wherever we work, live, and gather on is traditional Indigenous territory. TRCA respectfully acknowledges that the lands we are situated on are traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Through our work with land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, TRCA appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. We are also grateful for the continued work of many Indigenous peoples who are the original caretakers of this land and humbly acknowledge our responsibility to respect Indigenous perspectives and elevate Indigenous voices. We invite you to acknowledge the territories and treaty lands in your local area and encourage you to explore the interactive map at native-land.ca. Thank you. Back to you,
Yeah,
Mustafa.
yeah. Thank you, Jessica, for the land acknowledgement. Today we're gonna have our first speaker. That she's gonna introduce the topic of her town hall tonight about queer ecology. We're gonna have first May. May Matchim is an artist and a naturalist based in Toronto. She's been involved with a number of environmental organizations, including the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center and Royal Ontario Museum. May is currently working on feature-length queer ecology documentary called Understanding Myself as Amphibian. So yeah, floor is yours, May.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to see so many people joining us here tonight. It's always fun to talk about this topic and yeah, to have these kinds of conversations. I think it's really important. So I'll share my screen and I'll get started with my PowerPoint, and then afterwards we will have some time for me to answer some questions after we have our second speaker. So I'm just going to share my screen. If anyone has any trouble seeing the presentation or anything, please let me know. So this is queer ecology. So what is queer ecology? So this field, it first starts to emerge in the early 1990s. There's a researcher who's a professor at York University here in Toronto named Dr. Kate Sandilands, who's a really pivotal figure in the development of the field. Dr. Sandilands has done a lot of research in queer ecology and went on to co-edit a collection of essays and academic writing called Queer Ecologies around 2010. Another really big milestone in the year 1999 was the publishing of a book called Biological Exuberance by a Canadian researcher named Bruce Bagamo. And this book was a really incredibly exhaustive account of sort of the sexual diversity of the wildlife around us, and particularly same-sex sexual behavior. And it really helped change public perceptions around this behavior. Prior to this book coming out, there was a lot of skepticism from the scientific community about same-sex sexual behavior. There was a lot of sort of explanations and excuses that scientists would try to offer to try to dispute its existence, or argue that these animals were, like making some sort of mistake, or they were sick or diseased, or it was some sort of like dominance display or what have you. And that book really helped change public perceptions and help shift the consensus there. Queer ecology helps, or it encompasses a wide variety of practices, including academic work, research, as well as art and activism. And recently it started to gain greater public recognition. There's more and more documentaries and books and podcasts and articles being written about this all the time, which is really wonderful. The public excitement around it is sort of reaching new heights. To help put things into perspective, I'll talk a little bit about sort of the range and the diversity of some of these behaviors that have been seen in wildlife. And I've included these in-text citations throughout the presentation because sometimes when I give presentations like this, people are a little bit skeptical. They see me and they think that maybe I made this up or I'm exaggerating. So there's references to different scientific papers and books and things like that throughout the presentation. If you're really keen and interested, you could look some of these things up. So homosexual behavior has been scientifically documented in over 1,500 animal species. That behavior occurs in a diverse array of organisms. That includes mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, mollusks, insects, and arachnids. Every major group of animals, same-sex sexual behavior is present. There's over 500 species of fish that can change their sex. Some of them can actually do this more than once, which is really cool. There's species of fish that can change their sex from male to female and species that can change their sex from female to male. And here's just a few organisms that we can find in Ontario, including the piping plover we have there on the far right, and the monarch butterfly there, which are all known to engage in this type of behavior. Homosexual behavior has been scientifically reported in over 260 mammal species, including all of these species on screen there, including these are all Canadian mammals, including a lot that are found in Ontario, like the eastern gray squirrel and the white-tailed deer, and the little brown bat, things like that. And over 130 species of birds participate in same-sex sexual behavior. And again, all these photos here show some of those species, and these are all Ontario species. Some of these are pretty familiar, things like the mallard and the ring-billed gull and the rock dove, the pigeon there. So these are all species that you can find in Canada. It's interesting to think about that range of behavior. There's a really cute photo there on the right side of the screen showing two male mallards courting one another. So all these species here participate in courtship, in pair bonding. So in these species, scientists have observed individuals of the same sex courting one another. Sometimes birds will do things like they'll present food to one another, or they'll do these sort of elaborate dances, and there's these rituals. A really interesting example of that is the piping plover, which was, we had as the promotional photo for this town hall. And there's a picture of one sort of in the lower right-hand side there, where at Wasaga Beach, at Darlington Beach, which is out by Oshawa, only a few years ago, only around 2021, scientists observed two female piping plovers courting one another for the first time. They do this sort of elaborate dance-like thing. And that was the first time that had ever been observed. So that's kind of a cool first that was observed recently. Sometimes that includes nest building, including in the Canada goose, you can see on the right there. Male Canada geese will sometimes build nests together. Parenting, a lot of species of birds and some mammals, there'll be same-sex couples that raise young together. A really cool example of that is a bird we have in Ontario called the hooded warbler. We'll talk a little bit about how they raise young together in just a second here. So how do two same-sex animals have young together? So we have the hooded warbler there on the left. It's a tiny songbird that we have in southern Ontario. And sometimes there are male-male couples, and they will adopt eggs that have been abandoned in existing nests. Sometimes something like a snake or a squirrel will approach the nest, and the female, who's incubating those eggs will get scared and will abandon the nest as sort of a survival mechanism, and will try to go on and produce another clutch of eggs that breeding season. And so oftentimes there are abandoned hooded warbler nests. So sometimes these male-male couples will actually adopt these abandoned eggs and raise as their own. There's also a species of bird called the brown-headed cowbird that's a nest parasite. So they actually don't build their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds and hope that the parents will raise them as their own young. And so sometimes male cowbird couples will actually raise a baby cowbird that's been left in a nest sort of as like a foster child. And then on the right, there's the ring-billed gull. This is the most common gull we have here in Ontario. It's the one you see at like the mall parking lot, like out front of a McDonald's. And there's a lot of same-sex female pairings in gulls and terns in several species. In some colonies of ring-billed gulls, up to 12% of the couples are both females. And sometimes one of those partners will mate with a male, and that allows them to produce viable eggs, which hatch, and then the female pairings are able to raise those babies as their own. But sometimes they'll actually steal the eggs from other couples, which is kind of funny, and then sort of raise those babies as their own as well. Another sort of key point that I think is important to distinguish is the difference between gender and sex. A lot of the time we throw these terms around and we sort of use them interchangeably. But researchers, scientists, academics, gender theorists like to try to differentiate between the two most of the time. So when we talk about gender, we tend to talk about there being like a social construction there or social roles, like there's a social function there, versus sex, which we tend to think of as being more biological and involving the body of an organism, whether it's a plant or an animal or a human. So we would tend to distinguish between male, intersex, or female as being sexes, versus a gender might be non-binary, genderqueer, a man, a woman. So we think of animals as having sexes and plants as having sexes, but some researchers have argued that animals also possess gender in some cases, including a researcher named Joan Roughgarden. So on the left, we have this fish called a bluegill, and they're very common in Ontario. We find them in a lot of ponds, even in places like High Park here in the city and in Lake Ontario. And there's three very distinct types of male bluegills. There's a very large and aggressive subset of the males, and when they're courting the females and trying to mate with them, they tend to be very aggressive and chase away the other males, and they'll sometimes even be physically aggressive towards the females. There's also a very small type of male bluegill, and they have almost very, very different bodies and very different behavior. Like they are serving very different social functions, and they have very different strategies for reproduction. So the small male bluegills will kind of sneak in there and try to mate with some of the females. But there's like an intermediate. There's a medium-sized male bluegill, and they're really interesting because they do something that almost resembles a courtship with the large, aggressive male bluegills, and they enter this sort of partnership. And the large male bluegills tend to be more successful in their attempts to mate with females when they have one of these medium male bluegills that they're sort of in alliance with. In her book, Evolution's Rainbow, the researcher Joan Roughgarden sort of jokingly calls them like the marriage broker or relationship counselor males. So it's almost, even though they're all like classified as male, it's almost as if there's three different body sizes, morphologies of these male fish, and three different roles that they serve. And similar with this bird here on the right, the ruff, you can see pictures of these three different types of males. There's one called the independent, and they're the really flashy, showy ones that they put on these sort of elaborate displays to try to attract the females. The one in the middle, the fader, is almost identical in appearance to a female. And again, similar to those small bluegills, they try to sneak in there and mate with the females. And then there's this other type called the satellite, which are they sort of have the middle in the social standing. They're not quite as dominant or aggressive as the independents, and they're tolerated it's called a lekking ground, the place where these birds display and try to attract mates. So again, three very different looking types of male ruffs that do very different types of behavior. So it raises some really interesting questions about whether animals possess gender. I think another really important topic to discuss is the idea of sexual dimorphism. So in some species, like we have this northern cardinal here, and most of us are probably familiar with them, there's a very obvious visual difference between what a quote-unquote male and a quote-unquote female looks like. You can see that the male is the red one, and the female is more orangish-brown. There's a lot of species where that difference is very clear, but a lot of species where it isn't too. Gynandromorphs are a really interesting sort of subversion of this. So you take the cardinal, and you can see this one on the right. And this photo was taken in 2019 in Erie, Pennsylvania by a birder named Shirley Caldwell. And you can see that it shows a bird that's perfectly divided down the middle, half male and half female. And when an animal like this is perfectly divided like that, scientists call it a bilateral gynandromorph. Bilateral sort of refers to the symmetry. Sometimes you hear the term bilateral symmetry, and that's when something is like perfectly divided like that. So I'll show a few more pictures here. This is a specimen of a finch called an evening grosbeak, another Ontario bird that I got to see in the Museum of Nature collections in Gatineau, Quebec recently. And again, you can see it's perfectly divided down the middle, half male on one side, half female on the other. So how does this even happen? So gynandromorphs, we see it in birds. We see it in a lot of invertebrates as well. We see it in arachnids, crustaceans, insects. There's some really beautiful photos out there of butterflies where one wing looks totally different than the other, or lobsters that are one color on the one side and another color on the other side. In the case of birds, most bird egg cells have one nucleus in the middle, but occasionally there'll be an egg that has two nuclei. And if there's a sperm carrying the quote-unquote male genetic material and another sperm carrying the chromosomes that are associated with female birds, and they fertilize each of those nuclei, it can actually develop that egg into a single bird that's perfectly divided down the middle, half male and half female. So it really is, it's not just the plumage, it's the entire body. Like that finch that I saw in Gatineau at the Museum of Nature collections, on that tag, it notes that, one side of the bird there was an ovary, and then on one side of the bird there was a testes. So it was perfectly divided, half male and half female. So it's a really interesting subversion of the traditional sex binary that we can see in birds and butterflies and other organisms. Another cool subversion of this are andromorphs. So you can see the mallard duck there, the male and the female look very different. This bird on the right started off life with a more typical female plumage, and as it got older, developed a more male plumage. And I've seen these birds in Burlington, I've seen them in High Park, in Toronto. If you look around enough, you can you can see some of these andromorphs out there. And scientists haven't really studied why this happens to some quote-unquote female birds, but it probably has to do with changes in hormone levels and higher levels of testosterone over the bird's life. But we're not really sure why this happens. Here's some more examples of some other birds. It tends to be more prominent in waterfowl and ducks and geese and things like that, and then some game birds like pheasants as well. But you can see it in the wood duck and the green-winged teal and things like that, and the pintail. The hooded warbler that we talked about earlier has another really interesting example of this, where many female hooded warblers, again, as they get older, tend to begin to look more like males. So these are specimens of the hooded warbler that I saw in the ROM collections here in Toronto. And the one at the top is a male, and the one at the bottom is a female. So you can see that really distinctive black hood. It's also in that photo on the left, and that's something that the male birds have. But that bird in the middle is a female that's starting to develop that hood as it gets older. And in some populations, 5–10% of female hooded warblers are visually indistinguishable from their male counterparts. As they get older, they start to develop that hood. And again, scientists haven't really studied this, but it probably has to do with hormone levels or something like that. Red-winged blackbird, another good example of this. This is a picture I was sent from a bird bander in Maryland named Marin Gimple. So this is an older female red-winged blackbird that's starting to look a lot like a male. Hummingbirds, there's a really interesting phenomenon here called female limited polymorphism, where in some of these populations of different hummingbird species, 20% of females look like males. And this is very common in several species of hummingbird across the world. And one of the hypotheses is that if the females look more like a male, that males that are trying to mate with them will bother them and harass them less. So it might actually be an evolutionary strategy to avoid being harassed by male birds. There are lots of birds that subvert some of the sex roles and expectations we have. There's species where the females are more colorful than males. I mean, traditionally we think of birds like the cardinal and the majority of the birds that we see, where the male is flashier and more colorful. But there are species like the belted kingfisher that we have here in the GTA, where the female has that beautiful like reddish brown on the chest and is more colorful than the male. That bird on the left there, the Wilson's phalarope, is another great example of that, where the female phalaropes are much more colorful and more brighter looking than the males are. And they also subvert sort of traditional sex roles for parenting. The male phalaropes are actually the ones that incubate the eggs and raise the young. The female phalaropes will just sort of mate, lay their eggs, and then return to the sea to mate with other partners and feed. And same with the spotted sandpiper, which is a bird that breeds on some of the beaches around the GTA. It's another shorebird, and that's another species where the male incubates the eggs and raises the young. Another area where a lot of birds subvert sort of our sex roles that we expect from them is in song. Over 660 species of birds worldwide, female birds, have been reported to sing. Again, we tend to think stereotypically of male birds being the ones that are singing. But that includes over 150 different species in North America, including all these species here, which are found in Ontario. So there's a lot of species that are sort of subverting our expectations of sex roles and subverting the sex binary. One of the areas that I think is most interesting is sex change. Like I mentioned earlier, that occurs in a lot of different types of animals, particularly fish. Clownfish are kind of the famous example of that. But it also happens in crustaceans and mollusks, things like shrimp and clams and things like that, scallops. Some of these types of fish can even change their sex more than once, which is kind of cool. One of the most common species of amphibians in North America, and one that we have right here in Toronto, you can find them in anywhere, in Evergreen Brickworks, in High Park, at Tommy Thompson Park in Leslieville. They're very common, is the green frog. And back in 2019, this researcher named Max Lambert was looking at different green frog populations and looking at sex change. And compared different populations. Some were found in really polluted suburban environments, in like water runoff ponds where there was a lot of human impacts, and then compared populations that were in pristine woodlands where they had to walk in 2 hours to access them, where there was no pollution, and found that green frog populations were changing sex at the same rates in these more human impacted habitats as well as in these more pristine, healthy wetlands. And so the researchers came to the conclusion that sex change is a totally natural part of their biology. And up to about 12% of these populations of frogs were changing their sex, which is really cool. It's also fun to get into plant reproduction. Plants have really complicated and fascinating ways of reproducing and challenge our understandings of sex and reproduction. So about 94% of flowering plants are what scientists call monoecious. And in monoecious plants, they have both the pollen-producing reproductive part called the anther, which scientists traditionally sort of classify as being male, and then the ovule-producing reproductive part, which is called the pistil. You may have heard of the anther. That's the stamen, which is part of that, which scientists sort of characterize as female. The ovule, becomes the seed. So they have both the quote-unquote male and quote-unquote female reproductive parts in the same plant. And most of the time, these are actually in the same flower, which scientists call perfect flowers or bisexual flowers, which is kind of funny. Sometimes they're in separate flowers on the same plant, but most of these species, they have perfect or bisexual flowers, so they're in the same flowers. So the vast majority of flowers that you see or trees that you see out on the street have both, quote unquote male and quote unquote female reproductive parts in the same plant. Only about 6% of flowering plants are called dioecious, and that's where there's separate males and females. So there would be, a tree that only produces pollen, and a tree that only produces seeds or fruit. But there's other rarer and weirder reproductive systems. Some are trioecious, which means that there are males, females, and plants that have both parts. And then there's androdioecious, which is plants where there are males and plants that have both reproductive parts, but no females. and then gynodioecious plants, which is where there are females, and plants where there are both reproductive parts but no males. And that picture I have on there on the right of a species called great blue lobelia, which is found here in the GTA and found throughout Ontario, is an example of a plant which is gynodioecious. So there are females, and then there are plants that have both reproductive parts but no males. Some scientists recently have started to question whether terms like male and female are actually like accurate terms or sufficient terms to use for plants, because the way that plants and animals reproduce is so vastly different. You know, animals don't have pollen, seeds, and things like this. And the terms male and female are kind of imported in the 18th and 19th century from zoology into botany. So some scientists are starting to argue that maybe we need to come up with better words to actually describe plants. Sex change is a phenomenon that occurs in some of these dioecious plants. So in some of these plant species where there are separate males and females, you can see on the right there, there's Jack in the pulpit, which is a common woodland wildflower, one of my favorite species. Some types of maple, like red maple and striped maple, again, that we have in Ontario, and some species of yew. It happens in mulberry as well, and causes problems for people who have, mulberry groves on their farms. One year it's producing berries, and the next year it isn't. A lot of the time, the exact mechanisms behind these changes aren't really well known. There hasn't been a lot of research on it. There was a paper on Jack in the pulpit specifically that looked at the changes in sex ratios after deer browsing. So after a white-tailed deer comes through one year and eats a whole bunch of these plants, they tend to skew female, and a bunch of them will change their sex to become female. And scientists think that's a strategy to try to maximize their reproductive potential, because it's easier to produce more plants if there's more females and fewer males, if the males are dispersing their pollen. That was sort of the line of thinking. In some cases, it may be due to stress or climate change. There's a very old yew tree in Britain that's over 5,000 years old. It's one of the oldest trees in Britain. And for most of its life, it's been male. But recently, it started producing fruit in the past 5 or so years. And scientists have speculated that it might be due to climate change. Orchids are really cool. These are all species. These are all pictures I've taken just like on my phone over the past few years of orchids in Ontario. We have about 60 species of native orchids in the province, and quite a few of them you can actually see right in downtown Toronto, which is really crazy. In places like Tommy Thompson Park and Woodbine Beach, and you can see lady slippers and things like that. Orchids have a really interesting way of reproducing. Both the quote-unquote male and quote-unquote female reproductive parts are actually fused into a single reproductive structure called a column. So you're totally unable to separate the two. It's just one structure. And because of that, orchids are often used as a symbol by members of the intersex community, which is kind of interesting. So we love all of this research. We love queer ecology stuff. We love these examples of organisms that challenge the sex binary. But there are still a lot of barriers in place. I recently interviewed a researcher named Karen Anderson out of U of T, who was the lead author on a paper that came out last year, where they interviewed a bunch of mammalogists, so scientists who study mammals, to ask them if they'd ever observed same-sex sexual behavior in the species that they study. And even though the majority of them had, very few of them collected any data on it, and even fewer of them had ever published on it. And that brought up a lot of really interesting questions about why scientists aren't collecting this data or publishing on it. One of the barriers there is that there's this perception that same-sex sexual behavior is rare. And so it makes it more difficult, perhaps, for scientists to get funding to do research on this. If organizations and funding bodies think that it's, they're not going to observe this, or it's going to be really rare, or it's not an important part of this, these species and their behavior, they might not want to, give money for it. There are disparities in funding and research priorities, and there is a double standard a lot of the time. There's still biases in place, and a lot of the time there's sort of a higher burden of proof that's required to prove that same-sex sexual behavior is actually taking place and it's not something else. We'll get into that a little bit, but a lot of the time scientists still try to dismiss it and say it's it's dominance display, or it's these two animals are they're fighting or something like that, or they're making a mistake, even though that same sort of skepticism isn't applied to sexual behavior when it's a male and a female of the same species. So here are some of the classic lines, going back, over 100 years that scientists have used to try to dismiss same-sex sexual behavior. They'll say things like, oh, it's, the animal's trying to show its dominance. It's a form of social bonding. They made a mistake. They were rehearsing for real mating, or in some cases, they'll go so far to say, oh, these animals were sick or diseased, or there's something wrong with them. So here's a couple sort of famous examples of homophobia in the scientific literature. There's a really funny one from the 1980s where this British researcher had observed two male butterflies mating, and he decided to name the publication that he wrote about this, a note on the apparent lowering of the moral standards in the Lepidoptera. So he's talking about the moral standards of butterflies. And he says, it's a sad sign of the times that the national newspapers are all too often packed with the lurid details of declining moral standards and of horrific sexual offenses committed by our fellow Homo sapiens. Perhaps it's also a sign of the times that the entomological literature appears to be headed in the same direction. And then this is a famous quote by a Canadian mammologist who studied mountain goats called Dr. Valerius Geist, in Mountain Sheep. He said, to state that the males had evolved a homosexual society was emotionally beyond me. To conceive of these magnificent beasts as queers, oh God. So there's a lot of, some of these older publications, there's some very overt homophobia, transphobia, etc., that you can observe. It's a really interesting and challenging climate right now. Even in the past 2 years when I've been working on my film, things have changed so much, and in many ways have gotten scarier and worse, particularly in the US and particularly in Britain. We're seeing an increase in hateful rhetoric towards queer and trans people, particularly trans women, and laws, targeting queer and trans people. And we're starting to see an increase of that in Canada, particularly in places like Alberta. In the US, you're starting to see more and more censorship and suppression of research under the current administration down there, and a lot of funding cuts preventing scientists from doing research. Something that came up in one of the interviews I did for the film I'm working on was speaking to a researcher based in Toronto who was originally going to go to an academic conference in Detroit, but the university told her not to go, saying that it wasn't safe. Which is wild because a year and a half, 2 years ago, you never would have had to think about safety traveling to the United States to take part in an academic conference. But because of the nature of the research that they were doing, it was a valid concern. There's a lot of it's difficult to think about this stuff, and it can be dispiriting. But there are some really great and really powerful examples of queer humans engaging with nature. There's a long history of queer and trans people finding meaning and community by engaging with the natural world. There's a lot of outdoor groups and clubs, things like Queer Forest Club, based in Toronto, which has some really great organizers. There's the Feminist Bird Club. There's queer birding groups, in lots of cities, including Vancouver and Montreal. There's a group called Queer Birders of North America. A lot of these groups are starting to pop up. There's really interesting spaces like Hamlin's Point Beach in Toronto, where it's one of the oldest queer spaces and queer beaches in the world. And recently it was threatened by development. And so you had this really interesting combination of, conservationists, biologists, nature lovers, birders, as well as queer activists, coming together to share their concerns and to try to protect this site. So there's a really interesting possibility to sort of build these coalitions between ecologists and queer activists and queer community members to protect these shared spaces. And then there's some really cool artwork too. Like you see these photos here. This is a really famous, beloved piece of Canadian art that started in the 90s called Lesbian National Parks and Services, that was started by Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan, where they dressed up as these sort of lesbian park rangers and would go to places like Banff back in the 90s when it was much sketchier to be doing this kind of stuff, and subverting gender roles, subverting expectations, and doing some really cool performance art along the way. Here are a few of the really great resources if you're interested in learning more about the topic. There's the book Biological Exuberance that I mentioned earlier. It's huge. It is a massive, massive book. It's very detailed, in depth. So if you really want to, nerd out and get into it, that's a good resource. Evolution's Rainbow I talked about too by Joan Roughgarden. That's a really great book. It's a little bit of a easier read. There's quite a good sense of humor there, but it is like a great piece of science writing as well. A great sort of YA graphic novel about this is Queer Ducks. It came out in 2022. And a really great memoir by a cool non-binary author named Sabrina Imbler is called How Far the Life Reaches. And it's about their life, but it's also told through marine biology and through sort of the life history of all these sea creatures. And that's a really amazing book. There's more and more documentaries being made about this. There's now 2 separate episodes of The Nature of Things about this. One just came out recently. And then there's a couple great articles as well, including one in the Washington Post by the same author as Queer Ducks. Here's a little bit about the documentary I've been working on. So for the past 2 years, I've been making a feature-length documentary about queer ecology, as well as the ways that queer humans have interacted with the natural world. It's been a really fun process. I've got to travel to places like Winnipeg and New York City and all over Ontario and places in Quebec to interview artists and scientists and academics and activists to talk about this subject. And yeah, partway through making it, I started to transition and I changed my name as well. And so that became part of the film too. So it's been a really fun process and it's been really wonderful to get to travel to all these places and learn so much with all of my friends. Yeah, I will pass it over to the other presenter, and then we'll have some time to get into questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, May. That was very informative and actually a new topic for me personally to deep through on it. So I'm glad that the Youth Council we host this town hall for today. We appreciate the knowledge that you shared with us. And yeah, for the next presenter, we're gonna have a small presentation from Kanu. Kanu is a queer ecologist and Canadian conservation crops alumni, currently working as a team lead on the TRCA Revenue Youth Team and a volunteer grant writer with turtle protectors in High Park. They are passionate about herbal medicine, foreign and fostering expenses conservation, about decolonizing the conservation sector while making a space for GT biopic um, to learn, grow, and heal through ecological restoration work. So, yeah, welcome, Canoe, and floor is yours.
Hi, folks. I will say firstly, Max, thank you so much for all of these beautiful case studies, the research that you showed, and like the world that you're kind of opening us up to with queer ecologies. I think there's lots of things to reflect on here, and I will also say for everybody, I don't have a presentation. It's really just a few points. So Max already mentioned Queer Forest Club is a group that's in the city. I highly, highly, highly recommend joining. They have applications open right now to just get prospective co-leads for the fall. So if you have any niche interests, whether it's in queer ecologies, whether it's mycology, whether it's butterflies, lepidopterists out there, I highly recommend that you apply. We have a link, sorry, May, not Max. We have a link that you can submit an application through. And then outside of that, I will just say I led a walk with them last April at Rattlesnake Point. And it was really beautiful to be with like-minded community members out in nature. I feel like, and I like, May I know that you can attest to this through the work that you've done with the documentary and with other conservation authorities as well, like the kind of conversations that we're able to have when we break down those barriers and connect in a much more natural and raw way are very expansive and very powerful. So I'll also quickly say, as I've been working in ravine stewardship as a QT BIPOC, I'm a trans masculine person. So we've had a really wonderful opportunity to have more expansive conversations that we feel are are really progressing this field. And I was just talking to my team today about how, ways that we want to further decolonize our perspectives. And that can be anything from having conversations about plants that we misidentify or that we, give gender to just in casual conversation, to examining why and where these gender norms kind of crop up from, so that we can kind of dismantle these parts of our minds. So yeah, again, May, thank you so much for the case studies that you've shown us this evening. I want us to be able to hold, space and some intention around the biases that we hold in the work that we all do, whether it's in ravine stewardship, conservation, film work, just even across the board. I know there's people here from quite a few different backgrounds. So I want to invite us to sit with those intentions and kind of think about what we want to take out from this presentation. And I think it's especially important because, as so many of us know and maybe participated in, we had the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising last month. That was Pride Toronto. So it's an especially important time, I think now more than ever, that we're bringing together this energy that we're kind of fostering here tonight, in with these reflections about queer ecologies and in with the considerations of how powerful collective movement has been across time, with the knowledge that we have that our environmental justice work is so deeply intertwined and ever more so powerful when it's brought together with civil rights movements and different groups in the city. So again, whether that be Queer Forest Club or other groups, I really encourage you guys to kind of expand your horizons out there. Um, and I'll also say, May, thank you for bringing up the suppression of research that's in the field. As much as we're thinking about the beautiful examples that are, it's just as important to think about those kind of subterranean themes and what's missing from those dominant narratives, especially as queer people, especially as a trans person, and as we kind of explore our interspecies relationships with one another, and the outside world. I'll also just close off this long rambled speech just by saying I want us to remember our inter-community responsibilities to one another. So it includes protecting our wild relatives, of course, whether they be queer or not, and one another. So if you see each other in person at a community space, say hello, reach out, have those harder conversations, and just, yeah, subterranean themes. There's a lot to think about this evening. So if anybody else has any reflections they'd like to share, I'm not sure what else is on the agenda. Um, I'll toss the floor over to whoever is meant to speak now. Thank you all for coming this evening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Kenu. We appreciate the interaction that you had. And so basically right now we have Q&A for our both speakers. So to give you guys an opportunity, if you are curious about anything that been mentioned within the town hall for today, it's your chance for just questions and answer. It doesn't have to be a formal question. Just you can just open your mic and speak up to our speakers if you're curious about anything mentioned today or they didn't mention. So yeah, please feel free to engage. Jessica.
Hello. Thank you, May, very much. Thank you, Kinu, as well for sharing. I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with one because I know there's probably many questions. Everyone's just getting their questions together and then they're going to pop their hands up. I know. So my question is about, I understand that there's like physical ways to see, the question is for May. I understand there's physical ways to see like if a mulberry stand has changed its sex, right? Because if there's fruit or not. But how would, you mentioned the frogs. How would like scientists going into 2 hours into the woods be able to determine if the frogs have changed their sex?
That's a really great question. I've read some of that paper, the Lambert 2019, but I don't remember the methodology there. I think they probably were taking a sample of the frogs from those populations and then looking at their internal anatomy, so like dissecting them. So it is pretty invasive, unfortunately. I know that that was in some of the cases where there was female hooded warblers that looked identical to males. When they were doing research on that back in the 80s, similarly, they were capturing the birds and taking samples and dissecting them, and that's how they were making that determination. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And also, I see Kanu put their Instagram over there in the comments, so feel free to reach out to them, as they mentioned. And yeah, feel free to have, just open your mic and ask any question like Jessica.
Hi, uh, my name is Mira, they, them. I just wanted to say that Queer Force Club is also going to have a skills share retreat in September. The information about that will be coming out in the next month or so. So they'll be having people who are going to be talking about birds, plants, and all that wonderful stuff. And it's going to be like a weekend getaway with just queer people in nature. And I went to one last year, and it was quite beautiful. And I would highly recommend, if you have the time and space to attend, you should too. And also, if you don't have access to gear or anything, that they will have gear available to use during the time.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I love Queer Forest Club. I've gone to a few of their events. I know Tyla and Kira, who are both some of the organizers involved with that. And then we interviewed one of the walk leaders who's been involved with the organization as well for the documentary. It's a really great organization, great group.
Thank you, Mira, for the question. Yeah, feel free to jump in if you have any question. If not, it's gonna be that's it for today. We learn a lot. We engage a lot with our amazing speakers, and just gonna give you 1 or 2 minutes if you have a question to ask. If not, Jessica, feel free after to jump in. All right, Jessica.
I have another question. Also, if
Yeah.
anyone has questions and they want to type it in the chat, that's good too. My question is for Kinu. I know because I work at TRCA and Kinu is involved with a couple of TRCA programs, currently an intern with Ravine Team. I was wondering if you might be able to share a little bit with the group about your experiences at TRCA and the groups that you've been involved with. Put you on the
Yes.
spot.
No, that's okay. I'm glad that you asked. My experience with the Ravine Youth Team and with the TRCA in general has been, I think, more than I could have ever asked for. I truly cannot recommend this group of people enough. I think it's one of the most passionate, like impassioned groups I've ever worked with. I think it's one of the most like willing to grow and have the hard conversations kind of group that I've ever worked with. Um, Everyone's been lovely, accepting, and um, I I honestly don't know how I'm going to move on at this point. But that is the nature of fieldwork. That's the TRCA. Um, I'm not sure exactly what to say about it. I also volunteer with the Turtle Protectors in Hyde Park. If anybody's in the West End of Toronto and wants to get into wildlife surveying or like wants to understand conservation from an indigenous-led perspective, I also cannot recommend that group more highly enough. They're on their third, going on their fourth year of operating, and they have a little bit over like 8 different parks in the West End that they monitor. I grant right with them, but the majority of our volunteers are placing nest protectors. They're mapping out mama turtle nests And they're also bringing in any wildlife that's injured to some of our partners. One was like all the way in Peterborough. A turtle needed special assistance. Most of them go to the Toronto Wildlife Center. So it's also a really good way if you're just now kind of getting into the field to get to know the community partners that are in this field and like start making those real connections as well. I hope that that's like a, yeah, I'm not sure what else to add. Oh, thank you, Jessica, for putting that in. Yes,
Yeah.
turtleprotectors.com. I'll also drop the Instagram for those who might want to
Oh,
check it out.
Yeah, Turtles Protectors is another really great group that's doing really important work across the city. Um, a little queer ecology tie-in there is the factor that helps determine the sex of baby turtles when they're eggs and they're being incubated is actually the temperature um, for most species of turtles. And most of the time, if those eggs are incubated above a certain temperature, most of them will hatch as female turtles. But in some species, there's like this weird like median area where if like the temperature is between a cold extreme and a hot extreme, like that will determine the sex of the baby turtles. It's really interesting. And then in some species, it's like genetically determined, similar to how it is in many other organisms. So it's a great example of just how like strange and arbitrary these kinds of mechanisms are.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I took a course on ecological restoration in the winter, and there is a wonderful scientist by the name of Therusha who is doing work on this, but related to climate change changing the sex and then the population rate for native species of turtles. So if anybody else is interested in that, I can send that in the chat.
Yeah, very cool stuff.
yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, I see Jessica mentioned if you guys have any other groups or spaces that focus in queer ecology, please feel free to share it with everyone here. So we can share like all the informations and engage together. Um,
It looks like we have a question in the chat here from Tisha, who's asking what the most challenging part of making a documentary and what part of the process keeps me going. That's a great question. A lot of it has been challenging. I think on a financial level, like it's expensive to travel to all these places and to pay crew members and things like that. I've been lucky enough to get a few sort of small grants from different organizations, including the Toronto Ornithological Club, which very coolly, saw a trans lady be like, "I want to teach people about gay birds," and we're like, "We'll give you some money." So that was really cool of them. The Inside Out Film Festival too gave me a little bit of money. I got some money from a trans healthcare group as well. A lot of it has also been like crowdfunding and my own money, making this. Um, right now I'm like at the very end of editing, and so it's been a long process of like getting feedback from people and trying to decide um, how many of those changes and suggestions to incorporate. And that's been tricky for me. I've never made a film this long before. I think when I first came up with this idea a very long time ago, I thought it would be maybe a 12 or 15-minute project, and then I thought maybe 25 minutes, and now it's close to 70 minutes. So it's just kept growing. um, what keeps me going? I think I sort of alluded to it earlier, but it's been this sort of interesting tangled process of like understanding myself better through making this film, and sort of like the title alludes to as well. And so I think it's been a process also, not only of like learning about scallops and gulls and turtles and things like that and orchids, but also of learning about myself and my own gender identity. Um, and just getting to travel with my friends and see all these cool plants and animals and things like that and get to go to different places. And it's yeah, it's at times very stressful, but also at times it's been incredibly fun, incredibly rewarding. Great question.
yeah, thank you so much, May, for that, and thank you, Tisha, for the question though. Um, I see someone put, yeah, I see Kanu put the feminist birding club in Toronto, if you want to check it out. And yeah, I think for now, Jessica, the floor is yours.
We have another question in the chat. So
Hmm.
I see Jennifer has asked, she's wondering, May, she says thank you to both May and Kinu, and what is the most surprising thing you've experienced in the making of your documentary? I don't know if you touched on that just now, but I think it's a new question.
Yeah, good question. I guess the two big changes that have taken place um, since I started making this film, I think I alluded to it in the presentation, there's been a huge political shift, particularly with the current administration in the US, where there's a lot of legislation targeting queer and trans people. Things are very bad in Britain as well. There's a lot of legislation, dismantling access to gender affirming care happening in the UK and in the US, and a lot of really a lot of hateful rhetoric, and that's becoming increasingly normalized in Canadian politics as well, which is really scary. Um, one of the when we went to New York last June, it was right after the National Park Service had sort of released this internal memo limiting the participation of its employees to take part in Pride celebrations or wear their ranger uniforms at Pride parades and things. And we were talking about that in the documentary, but now like the National Park Service has like removed the words like transgender and bisexual from the Stonewall website. So things have gotten so much worse. And like I talked about too, like with that researcher I interviewed, like being warned not to travel to the US, or even like plans for like submitting this film to like film festivals. In America, I'm now trying to, I've been chatting with other trans filmmakers and people in my life trying to decide like whether it's a great idea to try to cross the border. I know at least one person personally who's been held up by like U.S. border security who's trans, and that might have been part of that experience they had. So that's sort of like the darker, sadder, surprising thing or change that I've sort of witnessed. The nice thing is I have a different name now and a different set of pronouns, and I'm on estrogen, and I'm happier than I've ever been. And it's impossible to sort of separate that process of transition from making the movie, because yeah, I sort of was forced to sit down for a year and a half and think about gender constantly while making this. And I was like, maybe I should investigate some of this stuff closer to home and think critically about myself. And that sort of helped me push me in that direction and make that decision. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, May, again. Thank you for sharing your personal notes here with everyone. We really appreciate that. And I see Marie have another question about what do you see in the future of queer ecology? I don't know if you touch base on this regarding to the political environment in the US here and in the UK. Uh, if you have any answer for this question.
Yeah, I'd love to hear if Kino has any thoughts about this too. But I think interesting work is being done internationally. I think historically, queer ecology, it has its roots in North America, and a lot of work has been done in the UK as well. I think it's been a very white field and continues to be, and I think historically it hasn't always contended with sort of the colonial history and legacies of biology, evolutionary biology, things like that. I think increasingly um, this work is being done more internationally and the new approaches are being brought in, and I think increasingly there's sort of a greater understanding of the need to acknowledge and reconcile sort of the violent and colonial history of some of these fields, and how those legacies continue to manifest themselves today in biology. But I think it's an exciting moment as well, because like we sort of mentioned earlier, there's more and more public excitement about it. There's more books being published and TV specials being made and podcast episodes. Like people are seem to be really into this stuff. It's sort of hitting a fever pitch right now. So I think even in, I've heard from like people who work in, school boards who are starting to incorporate this stuff into like high school classes and things like that. People, reaching out, asking for resources, or, children's books starting to get published. So I think as disheartening as some of these, far right political movements that are targeting queer and trans people can be, it's inspiring as well to see that sort of momentum and that excitement.
Yeah, thank you, May. Kanu, do you have any insight about this question? Or
Question on the
it's about what's the future of what do you see about the future of queer ecology?
I think that this is a really good and big question. And I would also love to hear from, especially from anybody who has maybe been like sitting with thoughts that they haven't felt that they like are fully formed, but maybe they want to share. Um, but I'll say for now, I think that the future of queer ecology I hope and I see more of every day is bolder and louder and indigenous led and black led and brown led and as we push more and more like genuinely like visibly diverse, not just for the EDI quotas, but like really truly diverse in the perspectives that people are bringing into this field, outside of, again, just like your racial presentation, whether or not you even are visibly queer. Like, it's for me about how willing are you in this space of queer ecology, of queer conservation, of land stewardship in general to push the envelope when you see something that our generation is really clocking as outdated and as colonial and as dangerous and as violent as we're seeing that these structures are becoming when we allow them to perpetuate because we don't start those conversations and say, hey, like I've seen things be able to be done a different way. And that can happen on so many different levels, but this is definitely one of them in that once again, like I'll bring it back to center, like the case studies that are presenting right now, including things that like might feel like an anomaly, but a lot of that is a factor of suppression within what is like inherently queer ecology in large data sets and in like academia that suppression becomes violent because, and please stay with me here, the dominant rhetoric that comes from that is that queer is not normal, queer is not natural, right? So then our work as queer ecologists, as queer foresters, as queer land stewards, as queer whoever you are and whoever you aspire to be in this room today, like it's truly vital for you to find your voice and find people who are willing to step outside of their comfort zone in this field to say, I want to make a change. And it can be through conversation with the trees, it could be through conversation with the people you work with, it could be through conversation here, honestly. I'm just coming in new today. I haven't joined the TRCA Youth Council before. But if your guys' events are anything like this going forward, like it's absolutely a space that I would love to be in because I think that now more than ever, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling now, but having the safe space to think about these queer ecologies, these queer futures, like this is such a good question because we're dreaming in this space now today, like that is life-giving. And I hope that everything that I just said makes sense and that if it doesn't, take what resonates and leave the rest. But again, if anybody else has any thoughts on the future of queer ecology, please share because we need them. And thank you, Mira, for this question.
Yeah, thank you, Kanu. We're really glad that we have you today. Sorry.
Oh, so I was just responding to Jessica. She said, haven't joined the TRCA Youth Council yet. Join today. I promise.
Yeah, join today. Yeah, that's what I want to say. Join the youth council so we can shape the conversations and provide safe space for everyone and it's a great opportunity. It's my first year with the youth council, and I think I will just continue doing that because it's a nice place to be in and share knowledge and learn from people like me and Kinu, and yeah. So I'll give an eye to the comment section. I think Kinu had another question, but it was for me, right? About any advice for fellow young queer filmmakers and artists regarding to their visibility representation within queer arts. Um, yeah.
Great question. And yeah, I just wanted to say you're very, very well spoken, Kinu, and it's really nice to finally, yeah, be able to chat with you and to hear you share all your thoughts. It's been a really great experience. I think I've followed you on Instagram for a while. I was sort of doing the math in my head. So I'm glad we had the opportunity to like Zoom meet each other and have this conversation tonight. Um, yeah, I this makes me think of a quote I read recently. There's this cartoonist named Maddie Lipchansky that I really like, who's a trans lady, and somebody asked them, like, what do you think about sort of like representation um, as a trans woman and as a cartoonist and everything? And they said there's already going to be like a section of the population who doesn't like you and doesn't like what you're doing by the very sort of like nature of your identity. Um, so just make something that's like true to yourself and do what you want to do, and don't be afraid to be weird and messy and potentially like strange and off-putting. Like, it's so important to authentically make what you want to make, even if it's only for you or for 5 people in the room, even if you don't at the end you're not, I don't know, maybe not totally happy with how it turns out. It's so important to just make something, as a queer person, as a trans person, and try to get those thoughts out, and it will resonate with people a lot of the time. Um, and that's such a powerful thing, like reading novels written by trans women, or reading comics or graphic novels or things like that. It's such an incredible, such a powerful experience. Or watching films by trans people, to see experiences that you maybe thought were entirely your own, or were sort of private, or you didn't quite know how to articulate, explored by somebody else or described by somebody else, is such a powerful experience and so incredibly affirming. And yeah, it was also a huge part of this whole process for me, and I think it is for a lot of people. So um, yeah, I would just encourage anyone who's interested in making any kind of art, who comes from this community, to go out there and do it and make it personal and strange.
Yeah, thanks, May, for sharing. Jessica, floor is yours.
Sorry, I hope I didn't miss this, but where and when is your documentary dropping?
I would love to know the answer to that question. I am hopefully very, very close to being done editing, and then it just needs to be color corrected and have the music done. And a friend of mine is doing a little bit of animation, so I'm hoping that maybe by like the late fall, early winter, it'll be finished, and then at that point it'll go to some film festivals probably for a while, and then who knows, it might live on the internet. If people are interested, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share a copy with people when it's done. There's a trailer out there somewhere, and a GoFundMe page and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, happy to share more details and chat with people about that as well.
Just look into the chat if you have additional questions. Uh, Youth Council movie night, yeah, could be one. Jessica.
Can I drop the trailer in if I found it on Instagram? May?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I can post a YouTube link. Yeah, just
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that would be good. I think I might have found somebody else's Instagram page, but your trailer's on it. So it'd be better if you posted it in there for people to check out. And yes, I love that idea, Tisha. A youth council movie night would be amazing.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, Jessica, do you think that's it for today, or
Maybe we'll
just
give people, 2 or 3 more minutes in case anyone has
okay?
any last questions or thoughts to share. I also invite anybody here that wants to plug any groups that you're part of that you would like to have, invite people here out to. This is a great opportunity. You've got an audience of 15 or 20 youth, so feel free to plug your groups.
Yeah. Okay. So it's Mira again. I will be hosting a Queer Forest Club meeting about urban agriculture and how we can get involved in it. That is still up in the air, and there's no solid dates right now. But just look out into the future. It'll be posted on the Queer Forest Club Instagram page, and you can find it there, and you'll have all the information there.
Thanks, Mira. I just posted the Instagram again if anybody's interested, because we've got a lot going on in the chat, so it got buried. So yeah, maybe if you want to close the meeting out, I'll pass it back to you, Mustafa, unless there's any last thoughts from either of our presenters. And a big thank you from me on behalf of the Youth Council to both of you for presenting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate being given this this opportunity and being able to have these conversations.
Yeah, I also want to thank you on behalf of the Youth Council of being here today, you and Kanu, and would like to stay connected, maybe to work in different other initiatives. And yeah, Kanu, I see your mic is open. Any last thoughts for today?
I was just gonna say that it's really nice to virtually meet all of you guys and thank you for putting this together. And that
Yeah,
I
of
hope to see you
course.
guys at maybe at a real in-person event because it sounds like there's quite a lot happening in this city, which is really, really wonderful to see.
We've
Yep.
I totally forgot about the housekeeping because the format of the meeting's a little different from our regular meetings. But yes, there'll be a newsletter going out. So if everyone has signed up to be a youth council member via the link in the chat, you will get the information about our upcoming in-person events. Our next virtual town hall is happening in August, and it's being hosted by Dr. Hopi Martin. And it's called Beyond Land Acknowledgements. Following that one's on August 25th at 7 p.m. So that will be in the newsletter going out next week. Following that, we've got some volunteer opportunities for Youth Council executive members at National Day for Truth and Reconciliation events. And then looking forward to the fall, we have a fall retreat at TRCA's new head office, showcasing all this cool sustainability features of the building. And I keep getting it wrong. Maybe Tisha could chime in here. I don't know if we are the most sustainable building in North America or the second most, but Tisha will be hosting the tour. I don't know if she's can turn her mic on. Oh, she can. She can tell you a little
Yeah,
bit more about that.
we're on track to be one of the most sustainable buildings in all of North America. There's still a lot of data to collect about the building to fully get a sense of sort of where we rank. And of course, it's a very sort of subjective thing to claim, most sustainable building in North America, because there's so many ways to be sustainable. But it's an awesome building, includes some technology that hasn't been seen anywhere else in the world. So some, global firsts at TRC's new administrative office. So yeah, excited to welcome everyone over at the Youth Council Fall Retreat, so we can learn a little bit more about sustainable technology.
Thank you, Tisha. That will be happening on either November 14th or November 28th. We're still up in the air with the dates. One is a PA day for Toronto TDSB. One is a PA day for Peel District School Board. So we kind of have to, we got to make a choice. One area is going to be happier than the other, but we still hope lots of folks can come out, whatever the date chosen is. So yeah, those are a couple in-person events coming, well, one in-person event coming up, Kinu, that we would love to see you at. We'd love to see you all at. So I think that's it. I want to thank Mustafa very much for chairing this evening. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for the speakers for all the useful information and the connections. And hopefully we're going to see you all in person.
Have a good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.
Yeah.